Jerusalem, spring, 30 CE. The streets are so full of pilgrims that you cannot see stone beneath your feet. Over 100,000 people crowded into a city built for 40,000. The smell reaches you before anything else. Livestock, smoke, strangers who have walked 3 days to get here. Lamb blood from the temple runs in the gutters. The Passover is tomorrow, or today. That depends on which account you trust. You are climbing a stone staircase, outside on a narrow street, somewhere in the upper quarter of the city. Torchlight from a doorway above you. Voices, Aramaic, low and tense. You've been preparing this image since childhood. You know this room, the long table, the white tablecloth. 13 men arranged in a row, the way Leonardo arranged them in a Florentine refectory in 1495. Jesus at the center, calm, luminous. Judas reaching for the bread. Peter leaning toward John. You know the words. You know the sequence. You've heard them at Mass, at communion, at every Easter service since you can remember. This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me. You know this night, except you don't. Because 3 of the 4 men who wrote about this night disagree with each other on what happened. Because the man who wrote about it first wasn't in the room. Because the church built the central sacrament of Christianity on an account sourced to someone who was, at the time of this meal, actively persecuting the people at this table. The torch above you is still burning. The voices are still there. And everything you thought you knew about what's happening in that room is about to be reconstructed. My name is Nathan. Some of you know the story by now. 12 years teaching history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. Resigned in my early 40s when the questions I was asking made the administration uncomfortable. What I do now is what they couldn't let me do then. Follow the evidence without knowing in advance where it leads. The Last Supper is the most depicted event in Christian history. More paintings, more stained glass, more cinematic recreations than any other single moment in the life of Jesus. Da Vinci's version is the most famous painting in the world that most people cannot name the artist of. They just know the image. I spent 3 months going back through the primary sources on this meal, not the catechism, not the theology, the actual texts, the manuscripts, the scholarly analyses of what each gospel author was trying to do when he sat down to describe that night. And what I found is something historians have known for 2 centuries, and that the church has never made a point of announcing from the pulpit. The 4 accounts of the Last Supper, written by 4 different men in 4 different decades for 4 different audiences, do not agree. Not on minor details, on the most fundamental facts of the evening. What day was it? Was Judas still in the room when Jesus broke the bread? Did Jesus wash his disciples' feet? What exactly did he say? 4 accounts, 4 different answers. But here's the part that stopped me cold. The oldest written account of the Last Supper isn't in any of the 4 Gospels. It's older than all of them. And the man who wrote it wasn't there. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 25. This is the oldest written record of the Last Supper in existence. Scholars date it to approximately 55 CE, that is 15 to 20 years before the Gospel of Mark, which was written around 70 CE. Matthew, Luke, and John all come later. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth about how they observe communion. Some of them are eating too much, some are going hungry. He's correcting their practice, and to correct them, he describes the original meal. Here is what he writes. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. That phrase, I received from the Lord. In the original Greek, apotou Kyriou. Bart Ehrman at the University of North Carolina, one of the most prominent New Testament scholars in the English-speaking world, addresses this directly in Jesus, apocalyptic prophet of the new millennium. Scholars have debated what Paul means by this phrase for 2 centuries. Did he receive a direct divine revelation, or did he receive a tradition traced back through the community to Jesus? Either way, here's the part that doesn't change. Paul was not at the Last Supper. At the time of that meal, Paul of Tarsus was a Pharisee actively persecuting the followers of Jesus. He was not in that room. He did not witness the meal. He did not see Jesus break the bread. And his is the account that became the liturgical foundation of the Eucharist for 2 billion Christians. Think about that for a second. The central ritual of Christian practice for 2,000 years traces to an account written by a man who wasn't present 15 to 20 years before any eyewitness put the story in writing. Based on what Paul received, he says, from the Lord. Paul's version is also the thinnest of all the accounts. No room described, no Judas, no foot washing, no swords, just the bread and the cup and the instruction to repeat the gesture. The Eucharist is built on the minimum, and the minimum was written by the man who that same night was still years away from even believing Jesus existed. Now let me show you something that should be in every introduction to Bible study, but somehow never is. Open Mark's Gospel to chapter 14, verse 12. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, his disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Clear, specific. The Last Supper is a Passover meal. It happens on the first day of unleavened bread, when the lambs are being sacrificed. The date in the Jewish calendar, the 15th of Nisan. Now open John's Gospel to chapter 13, verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival. Before. Not during. Before. John chapter 19, verse 14 is even more explicit. It's the morning of the crucifixion. The verse reads, "It was the day of preparation of the Passover." According to John, Jesus was crucified on the 14th of Nisan. That's the day before Passover. That's the afternoon when the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. Mark says the Last Supper was a Passover meal. John says Jesus died while the Passover lambs were being killed. These two cannot both be true. The Last Supper either happened on Passover, as the synoptics say, or it happened the night before Passover, as John says. The difference is exactly 24 hours. And 24 hours is the difference between the most important meal in the history of Christianity happening during Passover or not. Ehrman's analysis of why John changed the date is the most compelling explanation I've found. John deliberately moved the timeline. He made Jesus die at the exact moment the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. It's a theological statement. Jesus is the Lamb of God, and John's Gospel positions him to die at the precise moment that identity becomes visually, historically, ritually undeniable. John did not record what happened. He arranged what happened to say something. This is not a fringe scholarly argument. This is the consensus position of mainstream New Testament scholarship. John changed the date, which means the Church has built the most sacred meal in Christianity on a timeline that its own scriptures cannot agree on. The 14th of Nisan or the 15th, Mark or John. And the Church, rather than tell you this, taught you both Gospels simultaneously. Let you assume they agreed. Let the contradiction sit, unresolved, for 2,000 years. You've been carrying a specific image of that night since you were a child. You may not remember when you first saw it. It may have been a print on the wall of your church, a page in a catechism book, a poster in a Sunday school classroom, a plate in your grandmother's kitchen. It's been in the background of your entire religious life. 13 men arranged symmetrically at a long table covered in white linen. Jesus at the center, arms extended, expression serene. The men to his left and right arranged in groups of 3, in various postures of surprise and distress. Light coming from behind Jesus, from a window that frames him like a halo. You know this image. It was painted in Milan between 1495 and 1498 by Leonardo da Vinci, using Italian models, in a Florentine architectural space, 1465 years after the event it depicts. And it is wrong in every detail that historical evidence can verify. They were not seated on benches. In first-century Jerusalem, wealthy guests at a formal meal reclined on low couches arranged in a triclinium pattern. 3 couches in a U shape. Guests lying on their sides, leaning on their left arms, eating with their right hands. It was not a daytime scene. Luke's Gospel implies night. Jerusalem in Passover season was crowded and dangerous after dark. It was not a room in a Florentine palace. Acts chapter 1 verse 13 describes the disciples returning after the resurrection to an upper room, anagion in Greek, a stone room, in a private home, in a city where the streets smelled of livestock and pilgrims and the smoke of 100,000 Passover fires. The image 2 billion Christians carry in their minds of the most important meal in history is a Renaissance dinner party. And nobody told you that. Let me give you what the historical and textual evidence actually supports. Jerusalem, spring of 30 CE. The city is at its most volatile. Passover brings up to 200,000 pilgrims into a city whose normal population is 40,000. Benítez spent years reconstructing this Passover week in Caballo de Troya. His description of Jerusalem during the days leading to the arrest is one of the most detailed reconstructions in the literature. The Roman garrison doubled, multiple Jewish factions with armed followers, each with a different vision of what should happen to the Roman occupation. The atmosphere, not sacred, political, tense, a city waiting for something to ignite. Jesus and his disciples had been visible all week. The entry on a donkey 5 days earlier had drawn a crowd. He had disrupted commerce in the temple courts. He was known. He was watched. Into this atmosphere, a meal, probably in the upper room of a private home in the wealthy quarter of the city. Luke says it was prepared in advance. Mark confirms the same, not improvised. The room would have been lit with oil lamps, the floor stone, the couches arranged in the triclinium pattern, Aramaic spoken throughout. The food, if it was indeed a Passover meal, would have included unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and lamb. Not the leavened loaves and fish you see in Da Vinci. There were 13 men reclining in that room. Some of them had known Jesus for 3 years. Some of them, we know from the Gospels, did not fully understand what was about to happen. None of them, according to John's account, fully grasped what Jesus was telling them that night. That room exists, not the way Da Vinci painted it, something much smaller, much darker, much more frightened. Now, I want to show you something that 3 of the 4 Gospel writers erased. John's Gospel, chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. Jesus rises from the table. He wraps a towel around his waist. He pours water into a basin, and he begins to wash his disciples' feet. In first-century Jerusalem, this was the work of a household slave, not a servant, not a hired worker, the lowest rank of domestic labor, the person at the bottom of every conceivable social hierarchy. When Peter sees Jesus approaching him with the basin, he pulls his feet back. The text records his exact words, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus explains. Peter refuses again, says, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus says something so striking that Peter immediately reverses himself. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." And Peter says, "Then not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus washes all their feet, and then he explains what he did. He says, "I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, no messenger greater than the one who sent him." That act, that explanation, that argument with Peter, it is completely absent from Matthew, completely absent from Mark, completely absent from Luke. 3 of the 4 Gospels record none of it. I've sat with this for a long time. The foot washing is the most radical act of the entire evening. It is, arguably, the most theologically disruptive act in the entire Gospel narrative. A teacher who claims divine authority, placing himself below his followers, not metaphorically, physically, kneeling on a stone floor, hands in a basin, washing the road dust off their feet. And 3 Gospels don't mention it, not a passing omission, a complete erasure. Why? Raymond Brown, in The Death of the Messiah, published by Doubleday in 1994, raised this question directly. His analysis, the foot washing created a Christological problem. If Jesus, the divine Lord, performed the function of a slave, the institutional church's hierarchical structure becomes impossible to justify through his example. A God who washes feet is not compatible with a church built on titles, ranks, and sacred authority. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke left it out. John put it in. Maybe because John's community understood the theology differently. Maybe because John's source still remembered. But 3 Gospels made a choice. They knew about the basin and the towel and Peter's refusal. And they decided not to tell you. Here's the question the church has never officially resolved. Did Judas receive the Eucharist? Walk through the timeline. Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 18 through 21. Jesus and the 12 are eating together. Jesus says, "One of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." The disciples are distressed. Each one asks, "Surely not I?" Jesus says, "It is one of the 12, one who dips bread into the bowl with me." There is no departure. Judas is still in the room. Then verse 22. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Judas is still at that table. In Mark's sequence, Judas receives what became the Eucharist. Luke's Gospel creates the same sequence, chapter 22, verse 21. The betrayal announcement comes after Jesus has already shared the bread. "But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table." After. Judas ate the bread first. Then Jesus identified the betrayer. Only John's Gospel records Judas actually leaving. Chapter 13, verse 30. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out. But John's context is different. Jesus hands Judas a piece of bread as a sign of identification, not as the Eucharistic breaking. The question is unresolved. In the synoptic tradition, the man who betrayed Jesus may have eaten his body and drunk his blood. Raymond Brown called this a profound theological problem the tradition largely chose to ignore. Think about what that means. Every Catholic, every Orthodox, every Anglican who has ever received communion has participated in a rite that, according to 2 of the 4 Gospels, the betrayer of Jesus received first. Or didn't. And the Church built the sacrament anyway, on accounts that contradict each other, around a question it has never officially answered, because answering it would require choosing which Gospel to believe. If you've ever read all 4 Gospels side by side, something felt wrong. Not wrong like an error you could point to. Wrong like a sentence that doesn't quite pass, like reading 2 accounts of the same event from 2 different witnesses, each certain of what they saw, and realizing they can't both be right. You told yourself you were reading them incorrectly, that the contradictions weren't real contradictions, that there was a harmonization, a theological explanation, a way to read all 4 accounts as a single coherent story. You probably heard that explanation in church. The 4 Gospels complement each other. They offer 4 perspectives on the same truth. The differences are not contradictions, they're angles of vision. That's what they told you. Here's what scholars have known for 2 centuries. They are contradictions. The Last Supper happened on the 14th of Nisan or the 15th. Both cannot be true. Judas was present when Jesus broke the bread, or he wasn't. Both cannot be true. Jesus washed the disciples' feet that night, or he didn't. Both cannot be true. 200 years of serious New Testament scholarship has produced no consensus on these questions. The scholars know the accounts contradict. They say so explicitly, in peer-reviewed journals and university press monographs. They just don't say it on Sunday morning. You weren't reading the texts wrong. The texts disagree. And the feeling you had that something didn't quite fit, that the version you were given was smoother than the reality underneath, was not confusion. It was accuracy. Now we get to the part that most people who know the Last Supper well have never stopped to explain. Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, verse 36. Jesus is speaking to his disciples at the table. He tells them that what is coming will be different from what came before. Before, when I sent you without purse or bag or sandals, did you lack anything? They say nothing. He says, but now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Verse 38. The disciples respond, see, Lord, here are 2 swords. Jesus says that is enough. 2 swords at a Passover meal. And Jesus says that is enough. No explanation, no rebuke, no sermon on turning the other cheek. That is enough. Matthew doesn't record this exchange. Mark doesn't record it. John doesn't record it. Luke raises it once in a single exchange and never returns to it. And almost nobody who has ever sat in a pew has been asked to explain what armed men were doing at a Passover meal, or why the man who told Peter to put his sword away in the garden had hours earlier implicitly acknowledged those same weapons. Benítez has a specific answer to this. In Caballo de Troya, Volume 1, Published in 1984, he reconstructed the political landscape of Jerusalem during that Passover week. His reconstruction draws from Josephus, from Roman accounts of the period, and from the archaeology of the city. He presents the Last Supper not as a peaceful liturgical gathering. He calls it a war council, interrupted by foot-washing and bread-breaking. Jerusalem in the spring of 30 CE had multiple competing armed factions: zealots, sicarii, temple loyalists. Roman reinforcements had arrived for Passover. At least one of Jesus' 12 disciples, Simon, was identified by the Gospels themselves as a zealot. Benítez's argument: the disciples were not naive about what was coming. Some had come prepared, 2 short swords, and Jesus looked at those swords and said, "That is enough, not enough swords, that is enough of this planning." The meal that became the foundation of Christian worship was held in a city on the edge of insurrection, by a group of men who were not, in the estimation of the Roman garrison or the temple authorities, peaceful. That's the room Da Vinci didn't paint. I need to tell you something personal. My father and I didn't speak for 11 years. The details don't matter much. What matters is that we had said things to each other that we both believed, for a long time, could not be unsaid. In the spring of 2016, he called me. He had just been diagnosed with something that was going to kill him, though neither of us said that directly on that first call. He asked me if I would come to dinner. Not lunch, dinner. I drove 4 hours. We sat at his kitchen table, just the 2 of us. He'd made something simple, nothing elaborate. We talked for a long time, and at some point in that conversation, he told me something he had been carrying for 30 years. Something he had never told me. Not because it was a terrible secret, because he had convinced himself that the telling would cost more than the keeping. He was wrong. That table changed things, not everything, not all the years that had passed, but the direction of things changed. I drove home 4 hours in the dark, and I was different in some way I couldn't fully name yet. When I started going through the primary sources for the Last Supper, I kept coming back to that kitchen table. Because what Jesus was doing in that upper room, in the hours before his arrest, was the same thing. He knew he was going to die. He knew it that night. The disciples, according to every account, still didn't fully understand what was about to happen. He was in the position my father was in. The person at the table who knows that something is ending and needs to say something true before it does. The meal that became the Eucharist was not a ceremony. It was a man who knew he was about to die, sitting with the people who loved him most, trying to tell them something they didn't yet have the capacity to understand. It's only later, years later, after the end, that what was said at the table makes sense. 2 disciples brought weapons to a Passover meal. Let that sit for a moment. Not hunting knives, not tools, not symbolic objects. Swords. They showed them to Jesus. "Here, Lord, we have 2. And Jesus looked at those swords and did not say, "What are you thinking?" Did not say, "Put those away." Did not say, "We do not use violence." He said, "That is enough." 2 words. And then he went back to what he was saying. 3 of the 4 Gospels don't mention this at all. The Gospel that does mention it raises it once and never explains it. You were never asked in any church service you attended to explain what armed men were doing at the most sacred meal in Christian history. You were never asked who they thought they were protecting, or what they were planning, or why when Judas arrived in the garden with soldiers an hour later, Peter pulled out a sword immediately, as if he'd been ready. As if the 2 swords at the table weren't a coincidence but a preparation. The image of the Last Supper that Christianity handed you has no weapons in it. The text has 2. There is a room in Jerusalem called the cenacle. It sits on the upper floor of a building on Mount Zion. The current structure dates to the 12th century, built by Crusaders over an earlier Byzantine church that was built over a 4th century structure that tradition says stood on the site of an older room, 3 layers of stone above the floor where it may have happened. I stood in that room 6 years ago. It was a Tuesday morning in November. Cold, which surprised me. Tourists were moving through in groups. A young Israeli soldier was leaning against the far wall looking bored. I stood there longer than was comfortable for the people with me, because I kept thinking about what the actual evidence shows. This meal, or something like it, happened here, or near here. Some specific room in this part of the city. with oil lamps and reclining couches and Aramaic and the smell of 100,000 Passover fires outside the window. And 4 men wrote about what happened, and they disagreed on the date, and 3 of them left out the most radical act of the evening, and none of them could agree on whether the betrayer was present when the bread was broken. And the oldest written account came from a man who wasn't in the room. And out of those contradictions, out of those omissions, out of those competing versions of a single night, the Church built the central sacrament of Christianity, declared one version authoritative, left the rest unresolved. And for 2,000 years, people have been coming back to this room, not because they have answers, because the question is still alive. What really happened that night? I don't know. The texts don't agree. The scholars don't agree. The Church chose a version and stopped asking, but standing in that room 3 layers of stone above whatever floor they actually stood on, I understood something my father knew that night at his kitchen table. What happened at a meal is determined not by what was eaten, but by what was finally said. And somewhere in those contradictions, in those omissions, in those 4 accounts that will never perfectly agree, something true was spoken. Something true enough that people have been arguing about it for 2,000 years. That's not a scandal. That's the most human thing in the story. You decide what to do with it.